Amnesty International slams what it calls Trump-led politics of hate for eating away at human rights around the world. As things deteriorate, protest movements have been created to fight back. But will activism turn the tide on certain policies? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. It's a report which, frankly, paints one of the bleakest pictures in living memory of the state of human rights around the world. U.S. President Donald Trump has been singled out by Amnesty International for, in its words, setting a dangerous precedent for other governments to follow. The organization's annual report says Trump and other leaders, including Russia's Vladimir Putin, China's Xi Jinping, and Egypt's Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, are callously undermining the rights of millions of people. Amnesty says we've seen the ultimate consequence of hateful politics in what it describes as the horrific campaign of ethnic cleansing against Myanmar's Rohingya people. And it accuses the world of having a feeble response to reports of severe rights abuses, not only in Myanmar, but also Iraq, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Patty Culhane in Washington.
A bleak assessment on the state of human rights in 2017.
They will not look back and draw any lessons from this. They will look back and they will see that they were part of the drafting of some of the darkest chapters in modern history.
The foreword of the 400-page report takes aim at specific countries. First and foremost, Myanmar, accusing the government of committing crimes against humanity, which forced almost 700,000 Rohingya Muslims to flee. It singles out Saudi Arabia's blockade for creating a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. All of the countries fighting ISIL in Iraq and Syria for not protecting civilians, and South Sudan for crimes which forced thousands of people to flee from there.
Donald J. Trump is
It calls out the United States, calling President Donald Trump's plan to ban entry from citizens of several Muslim-majority countries a transparently hateful move. And it blames European leaders for creating the conditions for what it calls shocking abuses of refugees in Libya. It names countries it says are consistently violating human rights, such as Turkey, China, Russia, Venezuela, Egypt, and Iran. It also pointed the finger at 6 African countries for stifling public protests. This is the very first time that Amnesty International has chosen to unveil their annual report here in the United States, and they chose the Capitol building. They say in large part because they believe what they call his nationalistic and sometimes even hateful rhetoric and policies of President Donald Trump are spreading across the globe.
Anything that the U.S. does has a massive, multiplier effect across the world. But they're all emboldened by the fact that, trampling on human rights, abandoning human values is something which is acceptable today.
We asked the White House for a response, but didn't hear back. As for Amnesty International, it says it's not all bad out there. It sees the rise of hate being met with the rise of a resistance from the U.S.
What do we want? Justice!
To Poland, Venezuela, to Iran, which Amnesty says gives it some hope that just maybe 2018 won't be quite as bleak in so many places. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
All right, let's bring in our guests now. In Washington, Shetty, Secretary General of Amnesty International. In London, Amal de Chikera, co-director of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, and joining us on Skype from Jakarta, Benjamin Zawaki, a human rights researcher and Southeast Asia analyst. Thank you all for joining us. Salil, I want to start with you. You say efforts of U.S. President Donald Trump to ban entry to all citizens of several Muslim-majority countries based on their nationality was a transparently hateful move. What kind of effect has that had on the rest of the world?
It's, the United States is one of the most powerful countries in the world, and President Trump started his electoral campaign with a very hateful, divisive rhetoric against women, against minorities, against Muslims. And then in the last 1 year, our report shows how this has played out into concrete actions and policies. It's not just the discriminatory Muslim travel ban, it's also the massive reduction in the refugee settlement numbers in the United States. It's never been as low as this since 1980. He's also introduced the Global Gag Rule, which means that $1.8 billion have been cut in terms of women's reproductive rights. Now, I travel across the world and meet leaders from so many countries, and you immediately hear them talk about, why are you asking us about our human rights record when the country which has been the long-term champion of human rights itself is flagrantly violating human rights. I mean, the two people that come to mind immediately, the two countries and the two leaders, are President Sisi in Egypt and Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, who are, you can see them strutting around the world stage, brazenly violating human rights because they feel a direct sense of empowerment and emboldening with the patronage from President Trump and his administration. But I can give you many more examples of this.
Benjamin, the Amnesty report says that hate-filled rhetoric by leaders was normalizing discrimination against minorities. What is your reaction to that, and how do you see that playing out where you are?
Well, I would echo what Salil has said about the rest of the world. The examples he gave were in the Middle East, Israel, and Egypt. But certainly the same can be said in Southeast Asia. It's an area in which ethnic minorities proliferate. In some cases, ethnic minorities, if put together, would make up a much larger majority in their individual countries than the predominant ethnic majority does. And you have religious minorities as well, which sometimes overlap with those ethnic minorities. And what you have throughout Southeast Asia is likewise leaders at the national level saying to me and to others, look, the president of the most powerful country in the world has essentially legitimized racism both within his country vis-a-vis minorities and in terms of some of the statements he has made about other countries, offhanded statements, derogatory statements, racist statements, and also via his policies in denying refugees from certain countries from being able to enter the country, not to mention that those countries are also predominantly Muslim. And so you have throughout Southeast Asia a situation in which you have both ethnic and religious minorities, sometimes with those labels being conflated, more blatantly being discriminated against and having their rights violated on account of an example being set as far away as Washington.
Building on what Benjamin just said, how much harder does that make the work that you and your colleagues do in trying to stand up for human rights in the regions where you work?
Well, we work globally on the issue of statelessness, which we see very much as one of the most fundamental human rights issues. And what the Amnesty International annual report very powerfully conveys is that states are increasingly using nationality, using migration status or a lack of migration status as a means of discrimination and exclusion against minority groups. And we see this having a terrible impact in terms of the right to nationality and the rights that flow once people do have a nationality. And in the report itself, there are examples from the Dominican Republic, from Bahrain, obviously Myanmar and the Rohingya situation, and many others, which go to this very important overlap between the right to a nationality and the right access to other rights, and the role that discrimination plays in terms of denying people who have been denied their nationality of access to other rights as well. So it's an important issue, and I'm glad to see it being picked up by this report of Amnesty International, and it shows that there's a lot more work to be done in this field.
Salil, one of the issues at the forefront of Amnesty's reporting this year is, of course, the Rohingya refugee crisis. Now, when I was reporting on the Rohingya crisis out of Bangladesh this past October, I met a woman, a Rohingya refugee, who said to me that the fact that this can happen in this day and age doesn't just mean that her people are in danger, it means that everybody around the world is in danger. Is that sentiment in line with what is being reported by Amnesty International this year?
Absolutely, at many levels, because the Rohingya, crisis, which sort of erupted in August of last year, is not a new crisis. Amnesty has been reporting on the discrimination against the Rohingya for a long time, what happened in August of last year was that hundreds of thousands of people, Rohingya ethnic minority group, were pushed out of Myanmar, which is clearly a case of ethnic cleansing. And I think she's absolutely right that, this phenomenon is happening in so many places in so many different ways. And what is shocking is that it's not just the callousness of the Myanmar military, and particularly General Aung Meng Lang, who's really directly responsible for what happened in Myanmar, but it's also the kind of complete indifference of the international community and the cynical way in which the veto is used in the Security Council, because at the end of the day, if the Security Council is not, the permanent 5 members are not able to act on something as the kind of levels of crimes against humanity, war crimes that we are seeing in Syria, in Myanmar. Myanmar is a very clear case where people are fairly sure, the permanent 5 are sure that any resolution put to take action to hold the Myanmar military accountable will be vetoed by China. So she's absolutely right that what we are seeing is a mainstreaming and normalization of hate, divisiveness, and really an us versus them, a kind of scapegoating of minorities, which we are seeing in so many parts of the world.
Benjamin, building on what Salil was just saying, in the past you've written that although the root causes of the Rohingya crisis are within Myanmar, their effects are felt regionally and are of relevance elsewhere. Where are those effects being felt and how?
Well, I think they're being felt, to echo Salil, as far away as New York. I mean, look, we would be wrong to take the onus of responsibility for the ethnic cleansing, for the potential genocide in Myanmar away from the Myanmar army and the Myanmar authorities. But the larger failure here, we are 6 months removed from the beginning of this crisis. And you referred to it earlier as a refugee crisis. It's been referred to as a statelessness crisis. Those are crises that are more appropriately labeled in times of peace. But you still have people being forced out of Myanmar. You have people being exploited in Bangladesh. And it's been 6 months since this has taken place. Over 700,000 Rohingyas have crossed the border, have been forced to cross the border. As grave as the commission of crimes against humanity, potentially genocide, has been by the Myanmar authorities, as great has been the international community's refusal to take action. The world is increasingly globalized. There's no longer is there the plausible denial or the plausible ignorance of what has taken place. So when it comes to international peace and security, the very mandate of the UN Security Council, it has abjectly failed. The United States, China, and the other 3 permanent members have abjectly failed the Rohingyas. And for years, for decades indeed, we've talked about never again. And yet it seems that every 5 to 10 years, there's a situation that gives the world the opportunity to make good on that pledge, to make good on that promise. And yet time and time again, we have failed.
So, Amal, when we talk about statelessness and we talk about the... Oh, sorry, Salil. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, I was just wanting to make one point, because in all of these places, interestingly, we are talking a lot about, developing countries where this kind of, atrocity crimes are happening. But our report also refers to the way in which Europe is treating its the people who are fleeing from war and persecution, reaching the shores of Europe. I mean, we're talking about pushbacks into Libya, where the conditions are just shocking. But the pattern you will see in all these countries, whether the Myanmar example or Syria or Yemen, the language that's used to attack and persecute minorities and people who are weaker and voiceless is always couched around 2 main themes. One is national security and counterterrorism. So essentially, anybody you don't like is a terrorist. And secondly, the language of economic development and growth, that, this is putting our country, the economic, this is a sort of Trump's argument in this country, which is that, we have to make America great again, and we will make America great again by violating other people's human rights. I mean, it's the most absurd conception, but this is what has gained currency amongst this group of leaders, which is Trump, Duterte, Erdogan, etc.
Amal, I want to get back for a minute to the issue of statelessness, because obviously it's in the report by Amnesty International, but also it's something you've written about. What are some of the key factors of being stateless, and how much are the human rights of stateless people affected nowadays?
I mean, we see statelessness as largely a phenomenon that relates to discrimination, where because of gender discrimination or discrimination against racial or ethnic groups, religious groups, sometimes discrimination against disabled people, you have individuals and entire communities when it comes to groups like the Rohingya or Dominicans of Haitian origin being deprived of their nationality. We also have the arbitrariness angle coming into play, just picking up on what Salil said. So where increasingly political dissent is being punished by stripping individuals of their citizenship. And we see this happening a lot in the Middle East region. But as a global phenomenon, it's safe to say that states are giving themselves more power to strip citizens of their nationality under the guise of national security and counterterrorism.
Actually, Amal, I want to follow up with you on that point. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I want to ask you specifically about that because in the World Stateless report from your group this past year, it was written that the renewed instrumentalization of citizenship policy as a means to punish and exclude people who are different from society was growing. What do you mean by the renewed instrumentalization of citizenship policy, and does that tie into what you're saying now?
It does, and I think, I think states are increasingly, and this is a generalization, but states are increasingly taking quite a cynical approach to nationality, where it is seen as a weapon that can be used to stifle dissent. It's seen as a weapon that can be used to exclude those who are not seen as being part of the mainstream. So nationality, which people should have by right based on where they were born or who their parents are, is now increasingly being seen as something that the state can take away from you or deny you outright. And the implications of that in terms of access to education, access to healthcare, but also civil liberties, so deprivation of liberty, detention, removal from countries. I mean, it's a whole host of issues. And what we see is actually statelessness and migration and such issues now playing out at the very cutting edge of the human rights challenges and problems we see around the world. If I may, I also just wanted to pick up on one other thing that Salil said, which was the use of language. And I completely agree. There's a very dangerous swing in terms of the use of rhetoric, in terms of commitments to protect refugees, to not refool refugees. But I think that here there is also a role for us in the human rights field to take a more principled approach, to stick by our guns and to not use terms that are used by states in a detrimental way. An example on the Rohingya would be, I think we are on much stronger territory using the language of crimes against humanity than we are using the language of ethnic cleansing, which is a euphemism. And this is a challenge that I think I would like to push out to all human rights actors.
Salil, no getting around the fact that this year's report is extremely bleak, but there are notes of optimism that you and your colleagues have written about. Among them, the kind of activism that we're seeing in the U.S., particularly by women's groups, by high school students that are demanding action on gun control right now. Do you believe that this kind of activism can really effect change?
No question, but if I could just add a point to on the statelessness and
Sure.
nationality question, because we have to understand the kind of this is very interrelated to the flip side of using hyper-nationalism and patriotism and sort of uber-nationalism, and we are seeing this in India, in the US, of course, in Turkey, etc., where if you are not hyper-nationalist, almost jingoistic, then you're considered anti-national. And so the whole issue of, saying we are the nation and then the people who we don't like, who we are scapegoating, are not national, is really linked to the question of trying to strip people's nationality as well. So it's very linked to identity politics and divisive politics. So I just wanted to, put that in that context as well.
Okay, Salil, let me stop you there 1 second.
Right
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Let me let Benjamin pick up on that point as well. Then I'll get back to my original question to you. Benjamin, from your perspective, have there been positive steps when it comes to combating statelessness? And is there a country now that is showing leadership on this issue?
Well, Thailand has taken some initiative in the past several months to confer to confer nationality on erstwhile stateless people in the north of the country, some of what are called the Hill Tribe people. And what's surprising about that is that Thailand at present is under a military government, and one of the sort of I wouldn't call it a silver lining of such, but one of the realities of this military government is that it's able to take action in a manner that is much more expedient and much more direct than we're finding under democratic governments, not only in Thailand but elsewhere in the world. And it's very rare, however, to see a military government using that sort of power to confer rights as opposed to taking rights away. And yet, as you point out, Thailand is one country in which a very small number, in terms of percentage, a very small number, more symbolic than significant percentage-wise, but a small number of persons being granted nationality who otherwise didn't have it before. And it's opened the door to a much wider dialogue and perhaps a much wider effort on the part of the Thai authorities to continue in those efforts.
Okay, Salil, let me get back to the question I asked you a few minutes back, because I really want to get your take on this, about the fact that even though the report is very bleak this year, there are notes of optimism. And part of that is because the kind of activism that you're pointing out that's going on in different parts of the world, particularly in the U.S. Can you expand on that and say if you believe that this really could affect change right now?
There's no question in our mind that, that is really the only thing that is going to affect change. I mean, it's, classically said that evil triumphs only when good women and men are apathetic or silent. And, I'm deliberately mentioning women because, and young people, because these are the people who've really stood up across the world in the last year. We have one of the biggest women's marches in Washington, D.C. We've seen the kids come out in large numbers against gun violence in this country just in the last few days. But, we have to keep our minds kind of open globally on this question. We've had now a referendum on abortion in Ireland, which would not have happened without people standing up. We've had Poland, the people of Poland pushing back on the attack on the independence of judiciary. But Africa, I mean, we don't normally think of Africa. So African states in the last year, 20 states or so have actually attacked peaceful protesters. There have been beatings and killings. 30 of them have reduced media freedoms. But at the same time, we've had public protests in Chad against, increased market prices, young people coming out, Togo against oil prices. Can you imagine that we've had 4 African heads of state leaving in the last year who we never thought would leave? We're talking about Mugabe, 37 years in power, and several others who are 20 to 30 years. Take the Gambia, Jammeh going. And almost every one of this, South Africa, Zuma going most recently, and Santos, most of these cases in Angola where leaders have moved on, the role of people power and activism, particularly of young people, has been hugely powerful and instrumental. So, this country has never been so radicalized before. The United States, the kind of political awareness, consciousness, and radicalization of people standing up for their rights, not only their rights, but for the rights of others who are defending human rights, is very, very powerful.
Okay, Benjamin, I'm going to give you the last word here. From your perspective, the regions that you cover, very briefly, could you tell us, do you have cause for optimism right now? And do you believe there is a renewed sense of activism?
There is less so in Southeast Asia, I think, than what Salil is pointing out rightly in other parts of the world. And I think one of the problems is that human rights activists far too often are inclined to advocate human rights strictly on normative grounds, strictly by saying, look, it's in a particular treaty that you've signed, or it's customary international law, or it's simply the right thing to do. I think more and more it's not only important, but indeed imperative for human rights advocates to be able to advocate human rights on utilitarian grounds, to be able to say, not only have you signed this treaty, but it is in your interest to do X, Y, or Z. It's in your economic interest. It's in your national security interest. It may be in your electoral interest. Let's face it, politicians and policymakers are complex individuals who have to take human rights concerns into account vis-a-vis a whole host of other concerns. I don't think it should be above or below the human rights community to muddy their hands in the sometimes dirty business of affecting change, and that means utilitarianism as well as a principled approach.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Salil Shetty, Amal Dechikera, and Benjamin Zawaki, and thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the entire team here, bye for now.